Nvidia's weak spot has always been VRAM. Even over a decade ago, their Ti-class GPUs were sporting smaller frame buffers than AMD equivalents, though they have started to up their game in recent years. The Maxwell model was the last Ti card with a single digit of VRAM, and it's also the oldest one still getting driver updates. Does that mean it can still game in 2024? Back in 2022, I called the GTX 980 Ti the McLaren F1 of GPUs, mainly because it was the flagship gaming card when I came back to PC gaming after a few years of trying to be a normal person, so I still looked up to it like I did the supercars of my youth. The analogy doesn't go a whole lot further than that, however. Comparing the 980 Ti to the modern GPU market, only a small number of low-end cards like the RTX 3050 and Arc A380 are available with just 6GB of VRAM. And while the McLaren F1 still has an incredible top speed even compared to something 30 years newer, the 980 Ti is definitely closer to the hot hatch territory these days. Released in 2015, it still works with the latest drivers, 555.99 at the time of writing, though there may be some instances where the 980 Ti is missing out on some optimizations. I found in my last review that both Halo Infinite and Guardians of the Galaxy suffered from shockingly poor performance when compared to older drivers, and while I didn't have any such issues this time around, there was one case of a game that didn't even start with the latest drivers installed. Aside from that one issue, the 980 Ti is generally going pretty strong. It works with the DX12-1 feature set, runs Vulkan titles just fine, and 6GB is still just enough to run most games without complaints. However, sufficient VRAM alone doesn't guarantee a good gaming experience. To find out how the 980 Ti performs today, I'm testing on my usual platform for 2024, the moderately priced gaming PC, featuring a Ryzen 5 7500F and 32GB of DDR5. I can't completely credit the 980 Ti with this. Between my GTX 980 test a couple of weeks ago and the making of this video, the developers of Ghost of Tsushima have dropped a patch that fixes the tendency for certain parts of Jin to disappear when low on VRAM. That being said, at 1080 medium settings, I was seeing just over 4GB of memory being utilised, so that extra couple of gigs has definitely proven worth having. The game averages 40 FPS at these settings, a good 20% above the regular 980, but about 3 frames behind the Radeon R9 390. Meanwhile, in the other recent PlayStation port, Horizon Forbidden West, the 980 Ti puts in a great showing, again running at 1080 medium without upscaling. This time it leaves both the 980 and R9 390 far behind, with a 44 FPS average that's about a third faster than the non-Ti 980 and about 15% faster than the Radeon. It's also almost exactly the same score as I got from the legendary 1080 Ti, though that card was running at 1440p and at very high settings. It's not fair to compare Hellblade 2 performance to either of the other cards I've tested from this era. The GTX 980 needed dropping to the lowest possible settings and resolution, and it looked like a crime against humanity. The Ti has enough VRAM and horsepower to run at 1080p low without upscaling and get a reasonable quality image, though frame rates can drop to pretty unplayable levels. With FSR quality enabled, it still looks okay, especially in close-ups, but while retaining a 30+ frame rate. It's a remarkably similar story in Alan Wake 2, with similar frame rates at native 1080p low, though keeping a 30+ average required a bit more aggressive upscaling. Balanced FSR averages 35, with lows of the old cinematic 24 FPS. And while some people would say this isn't unplayable, I still can't recommend it, but for a different reason. Like the regular 980, the Ti suffers from frequent graphical issues, which manifest as a kind of COD-style flashbang. Epilepsy or not, I wouldn't want to play the whole game like this. I'd suggest steering clear. It seems like the 980 Ti has some of the same issues as the regular 980 does with Avatar: The Final Frontier, though to a much smaller degree. At full 1080p there was an annoying little 2D placeholder in the last section of the benchmark, regardless of quality settings, but enabling FSR seemed to help, though it didn't make a huge difference to LODs. 1080p with FSR performance looks surprisingly good for an internal 540p image, and at the high preset it can give a playable enough 33 FPS average with lows of 26. Dropping to the low preset and FSR Ultra performance had disappointingly little impact, only increasing the average to 43. In Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart, the 980 Ti can do pretty well, all things considered. Its 56 FPS average is a massive 40% uplift over the regular 980 at the same settings, and 50% improvement to 1% lows. I'm not the biggest fan of FSR in this game, so if the dips below the 60 mark are too troubling for you, you might want to drop the native resolution to 900p rather than using upscaling. In RE4 Remake, the old Maxwell card once more performs impressively well. I was able to run at the graphics priority preset, which resulted in a near 60 FPS average with lows in the 40s, though I did have to make one compromise. To keep within the VRAM limit, I had to drop textures from 2GB to 1, but in the circumstances that doesn't seem like too much of a compromise to make. In the previous video, I noted that the GTX 980 gave me nothing but error messages when trying to launch The Last of Us. It turns out that this is a wider GeForce issue, and even updating from 555.85 to 555.99 didn't help. I rolled back to 552.44, which is the set I used for the 3080 Ti review, and thankfully that worked just fine. At 1080 medium, the game just squeezed into the 6 gigs of available memory, and I even had room to tweak one of the less demanding texture settings up to high. The average FPS was 36, which is about on par with the full-fat RX 580 8GB and about 9 frames slower than the RTX 3050 6GB. Incidentally, I did go back and retest the regular 980 with the older drivers while I was at it, and while it manages a near 30 average at 1080 medium, the game is far exceeding the available VRAM, so 1% lows are only in the very low 20s. I'm in two minds about the Forza Horizon 5 result. On the one hand, at 1080p high with TAA, it just scrapes over 60 FPS, and in actual gameplay, it generally scores quite a lot higher than this, so I'm definitely inclined to call this playable. However, it's also only a couple of frames above a Radeon 780M iGPU, and about 10% short of the RX 580. Playable or not, this isn't aging well. Starfield is, unsurprisingly, too much for the 980 Ti. At full 1080p using medium settings, it can't hit 30 FPS. It normally defaults to 67% FSR upscaling, and that can just break past the 30 mark, but once again, we're in the same territory as a modern iGPU, and about half of what the 1080 Ti would be capable of just a couple of years later. Thanks to various updates and reconfigured presets, Cyberpunk 2077 has become a bit more demanding since I last tested the 980 Ti. 2 years ago, the game ran at 1080 medium at just short of 60 FPS, and at high that dropped to 46. Now, medium acts much more like high used to, with the 980 Ti now only managing to hit 48 FPS at the medium preset without upscaling. This is a marked improvement over the Radeon 780M, which only hits 40 FPS with FSR balanced, and only about 5 frames behind the 6GB RTX 3050 at the same settings and resolution. It's certainly possible to achieve playable frame rates in Helldivers 2, though graphics won't exactly be at their prettiest. At 1080 low, the aliasing is pretty harsh, but the average FPS is in the mid-70s, and 1% lows are around the 60 mark, so ugly or not, it should be at least fairly smooth to play. Call of Duty Warzone didn't do quite as well as I'd hoped, at least in comparison to the vanilla 980. At 1080 basic, it scores about 80 FPS on average, only 10% or so above the GTX 980 and 15% above the R9 390. Compared to some more recent offerings, the RTX 3050 hits almost 95 FPS at the same settings, and the 1080 Ti, just one generation newer, can exceed 90 FPS at 1080 Ultra. It's kind of crazy just how big of a performance increase there was from Pascal to Maxwell, and I'm going to look into that in more detail in a future video. So, the 980 Ti isn't really the McLaren F1 of the GPU world. I may have my own personal attachment to it, because of what it represented when I came back to PC gaming, but in reality, it's more like an old Porsche. It's iconic, certainly, and you can't argue with its legacy that can still be seen in modern cars, but it will get lapped by a modern equivalent. Anyway, enough driving metaphors. The 980 Ti had a good life, and I'm going to be celebrating some of its better moments as part of a video series next month, in which I'll be looking at the top-end cards from across the 2010s and 2020s. In the meantime, thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.